In India today, we have a whole series of of things that are conspiring to modify our outlook. I call it social modification. Through media, which is a very large part of it, and through education. We are taught, because today we are a part of the global economy, we are part of the consumerist world, we are part of corporate globalization, as I would call it. We are taught to want things, to need things. And if you don't want them and you don't need them, then you're not part of the elite. They are symbols of the elite. You don't have an identity if you don't have a TV and a posh car and a big house and whatever. So a lot of this social modification takes place within schools, because in schools today, competitiveness has become a major factor. You are told that if you don't know English, you can't succeed. And the market also tells you the same thing, that if you don't know English, you can't succeed. So there is a whole process of social modification that is taking place, and largely that social modification is also through the media, which is reinforced by the media. What this does is, it also says that corruption is a big factor. I mean, I won't go into the details, we know about Anna's movement, etc. But corruption is a major issue in India today. And corruption equals non-performance of government. Non-performance of government leads to a loss of faith in state. A loss of faith in state leads to a loss of faith in democracy. And then we say, well, the corporates are working. Wipro is doing an excellent job. So why doesn't Narayan Murthy come and run Bangalore? I mean, that's the kind of equation, that's the kind of logic that we are heading towards. Which means we are discrediting democracy. So the lack of participation, the lack of questioning is really, in a way, in my view, the fact that we as citizens don't participate is, in a way, one of the major reasons why democracy is at risk today. But participation is a natural instinct. It's something that all of us, the moment we are born, as a little child, you want to participate. You want to participate with your family, with your group, with your peer group. And in order to participate, you want to learn. You want to learn a language, you want to learn the social etiquette, you want to learn the customs, the habits, so that you can become a member of that group, of the family, of the community. So participation motivates learning, and that learning has to give you meaning, has to give you an identity, has to give you a membership, and then that makes sense. But if learning does not lead to participation, it does not lead to meaning in your life, then you won't learn. Because why should I learn? This search for an identity is one of the greatest, is the biggest motivating factor for participation. I want an identity, I want to belong, but I also want to improve my lot. I want to improve my situation. The UN Convention on the Rights of the Child in 1989 recognized this right as a very important right. And it was the first time that it was recognized. It was a fundamental right. I think it was a natural instinct always, but it was the first time that it was recognized in the Convention on the Rights of the Child in 1989. And the Convention on the Rights of the Child did a very interesting thing. They made it a cross-cutting right, not just an individual right, but a cross-cutting right. So, all the provisions that were prescribed in the Convention, such as education, healthcare, etc., were also underlined by participation. So what did that mean? That meant that I have a right to education, but I have a right to determine the nature and the quality of that education as well. It's not just you providing education to me. I have a right to decide or to determine the nature and the quality of that education through my participation in the discussion of how that education is going to be delivered. If there's a protection mechanism, then I as a child or I as a group of children have the right to decide, to determine through participation how that provision needs to be, how that protection system needs to be designed. So this brings us to a very important question. And I'd like to use the example of the right to education today. Today we have the right to education, but it actually is compulsory education. Now how do you have, and I feel this is a contradiction in terms, the right to compulsory education? I mean, you can say that all women have the right to work. Okay, fine. But if I said all women have the right to compulsorily work, then it's not a right anymore, because the element of choice has been removed. So these two terms do not go together. You cannot have a right that is compulsory. A right has to be a choice. And that is the contradiction we are facing in most legislations concerning children today. There is compulsion because we feel as adults we have the obligation to provide certain things to children, but we do not believe that children have a right to determine the course of that, or the structure, the nature, or the quality of what we are providing. So we provide it according to our convenience, according to our structures, and whatever is good for us. And I think the right to education is one of the most glaring examples of how we are violating, how we are converting a right into something that is a compulsion, and using compulsion to push children into schools. And of course, if we go into the whole education question of how we are closing government schools, starting private schools, asking the private schools to take the burden of, poor children by, the 25% of seats for reservation of 25%. You have private schools cater to 25% of our child population. 25% of that is going to, cater to 75% of our child population, because government schools are closing down. It doesn't really make sense. And you say it's compulsory, you have to go to school. If you don't go to school, it's a violation. This whole dichotomy or contradiction has emerged only in the last 15 to 20 years. When we started our work, which was in the early 70s, this contradiction did not exist. And we didn't live in a black and white world. A world where if you're for Anna, then you're against corruption. But if you question Anna, then you're for corruption. It wasn't a black and white world those days. There were grey areas in between. We discussed them. There were debates. We may not have agreed, but it was not black and white. But the situation of children was pretty bad. In the early 70s, I was a trade unionist, and I had a little group of people that I worked with, and we worked in the informal, unorganized sector of labor, which is in the Pina industrial estate and the hotel sector and the marketplace and the small-scale industries and cycle shops and mechanics. And we were organizing the unorganized, basically. And we found that there were at least 25% of the workforce were children under the age of 14. And in some cases, like in the hotel industry, it was even up to 60%. Now, when we were negotiating for the adult workers, we were getting settlements, improving wages, working conditions, etc., but we couldn't do anything for the children because the children were not part of the law. The law did not recognize them as workers. So if they worked illegally, and the law was silent on the whole issue of children. So there were no wage protection for children, there was no working conditions for children, there was nothing. But they were not banned either. So children worked, but without any protection of the law. So the children actually came to us and said, you're doing all this for the adult workers. We are also part of the union, we are also workers. What are you doing for us? And then we had to explain that the law actually was silent on the question of child labor, that there was no protection. So children, in their very childlike logic, they said, let's change the law. And we were a small group of trade unionists working in Bangalore, and we didn't ever think that it was possible to bring in a national legislation on child labor. But to buy time, we explained to the children what the law was at the time, and we started drafting an alternative law, a bill on child labor. It was interesting. The children approached it from a very different standpoint. They did not believe that things would change. They believed that they could change the working conditions, but they did not believe that they could solve poverty. And the large reason for children to work was poverty. And I think today, this is after nearly 35 years, 40 years, we still are dealing with poverty. We haven't solved poverty. The children knew the answer there. They said, you can't solve poverty, but you can change my working conditions. You can make it better. You can make it safer. You can give me education along with my work. We don't want a pension fund, but we want a career development fund when we are 21, so we can start our own little enterprise. We don't want the existing ESI because we can't handle the bureaucracy. We want something simple that is close to us, which we can deal with. But we were the adults, the ones we were also drafting something parallelly. We were a little more optimistic. We said, yes, we have to deal with the causes as well. You can't take a situation as given. One has to deal with the causes. And so our draft also included a development aspect, a very large development aspect, to along with the issues that the children raised. Our logic was that if you took an area, for instance, at that time, our estimate was 111 million working children in India. At that time, this was in the late 70s. Now it's 123 million or something. It's grown. It's become larger, the number. So our logic was, if you looked at the whole 111 million, it was an enormous number, and you couldn't work with that. But if you broke it up into small, manageable numbers and areas, it was easier to deal with. So we said, let's declare areas as child labor free areas, work towards it in 5 years or 10 years, but it has to be comprehensive development. It cannot be just banning child labor, pretending that children don't work anymore because you're preventing them from working. It had to be an addressing of causes as well. And that had to be part of the strategy. The children, once they finished their draft and we finished our draft, they said, okay, now we have to present this to somebody. So Chief Minister at that time was Ramakrishna Hegde. We went and approached him. He said, sure, I'll come. Let's have a presentation. Children said, fine, you are very good at making speeches, but we are not. So we are going to do a play. And they did a play, they put together a street play. It was quite exciting actually, because children know how to touch adults without shaming them. They have a win-win, way of addressing adults. And so they had these three situations, and at the end of it, this little boy, is frightened because, demons come and dance in front of him. And then he goes up to the chief minister and holds his hand and says, please chase those demons away. And that, of course, just sort of sealed the deal. So, I cut the story short, but ultimately we were able to go to Delhi and we got a national legislation. Unfortunately, the legislation forgot about the development aspect completely. Because including the development aspect in the national legislation would make it obligatory on government to implement that everywhere. So the development aspect was thrown out, and it was made the accent was more on the ban than on the development aspect. So the legislation that we got was not what was desired, but that's the legislation that we're living with even today. After that, we thought that maybe we should try and practice what we preached, try and experiment. And we believed that children needed to come together. I know many people disagree with the fact that, the moment you say that children are forming a union, I think union has a certain connotation in people's minds which is very negative. But a union really means the coming together of people, especially people who are in trouble or who are being oppressed or denied something, and it gives them an identity and a strength to be able to fight for that. Unions are not just to negotiate with an employer. Unions are not just to improve the immediate situation. Unions are also to transform one's life, to change a situation for the better. And the union is just the coming together. Unfortunately, in the trade union history, the recent history, I think unions have got a very bad name, because unions are seen as very negative and very, destructive beings. But unions are actually very strong. I think if 10 of us had a problem here, we would form a union. And you can call it what you like, but it would be a union. So children wanted to, because of the union that we already had, children wanted to form their own union. They didn't want the union that the adults had, they wanted their own, and a separate union. And they wanted to call it Bhima Sangha, and Bhima being the strong man, but we didn't want it to have a religious connotation, so we had a little elephant as the symbol of Bhima. Bhima Sangha gave working children identity. Now at that time, this was in the late 70s and early 80s, 85, children were able to say, I'm a working child and I need my conditions improved, and they were able to negotiate with the authorities to do that. And that was a tremendous strength for children. They were able to say, I'm working in a hotel, my hours of work are 9 hours or 10 hours, I want it reduced, I want a decent wage, I want protection, I want a better place to sleep, I want education with it.